Good afternoon, everyone. Hope you're all enjoying the conference. Thanks for coming to my talk this afternoon. So yeah, we're going to be talking about Blazor and Tailwind CSS. So interestingly, in contrast to Catherine's talk, this one is really going to be talking about not writing CSS, which is going to be quite interesting, hopefully. So before we get into it, I just want a quick survey. Who here's heard of Blazor, using Blazor? Show of hands. Cool. Who's heard of or using Tailwind? Okay, cool. Right. So this is going to be a fairly high-level sort of 101 style talk, so this shouldn't go over anyone's head too much, hopefully. So yeah. Okay. So just a quick bit about me. My name's Chris. I'm a software engineer at a startup in the UK called Enable. I'm an MVP. I've done a bit of blogging. I've also written a book on Blazor, and I also maintain the Blazor open source libraries, which just went past like 13 million downloads, I think. So that's going quite well. Must add more tests, though, as always. So let's get into things. What is Tailwind CSS? So Tailwind CSS is what's known as a utility-based CSS framework. So what's a utility-based CSS framework? Well, it's a framework where you take very small atomic style classes and compose them together to create a look. Now, it's probably easiest to understand this by contrasting it with a different type of framework, more of what I would call a component CSS framework. And a good example of that is Bootstrap. Who here has used Bootstrap or is at least know what Bootstrap is? Yeah, okay, quite most of you. Okay, cool. So let's use this as an example. This is the card component from Bootstrap's documentation, all right? So let's have a look at what that would look like in Bootstrap and then in Tailwind, and hopefully this will start to give us a bit of a feel of what it's like to use utility frameworks. So to create that card in Bootstrap, you will take this markup with these CSS classes, and that will produce you that particular card. So we've got a class of card on the outer, card image, card body, card title, card text. It's very clear this is going to create a card. At least you'd hope so. Otherwise, that's some very bad naming. But there's problems with this approach with CSS. You know, if I want to do something that looks very similar to a card but isn't quite a card, what do I call it? It might want to use a lot of the same styles, but it needs to be slightly different. So then I end up having to replicate everything over and over again. And I have these kind of really slightly different things that are almost the same but not quite the same. And this is a tricky problem, and especially when you get in larger applications. So how would you tackle this with Tailwind? Well, this is what that same card looks like when you do it with Tailwind. Now, the first thing you'll notice, there's no mention of cards here whatsoever, okay? What we've got is various utility classes that are targeting specific CSS properties to create that look. So the outer div has got some flexbox stuff on it. So it's saying it wants to use flexbox, and it's going to have the flex direction set to column. That's what flex col means. Rounded T is rounded top. That's because before I cropped this image, actually the card does have rounded corners, so that's where that comes from. H40 is the height of that image, and 40 isn't actually a pixel value or anything like that. It maps to a value in Tailwind's design system, which we'll talk about in a second. P4 is padding 4. Text gray 800 is how dark the text is, what color the text is. Text LG for the H5, it's semi-bold. It's got a margin bottom of 2. And the P tag has got the base font size. Now, these naming conventions can look a little bit alien when you first see them, but once you kind of learn them, you can kind of reel them off a bit like I have, and you start to actually give them their full name, not just MB2 margin. You start saying things like margin bottom 2. But what's great about this approach in comparison to the other one is that if I have something that looks a little bit like my card but needs a slight tweak, like I need, I don't know, a slightly different color, or I want to put the image at the bottom and the other bits at the top, I can literally just tweak the specific classes that I want to, and I can adjust that look. I don't have to go off into my CSS file and rewrite everything or copy and paste and things like this. And that's really where a lot of this came from, okay? Adam Waltham, who's the author of Tailwind CSS, actually has got a really good blog post where he talks about all of the problems he had over his career of trying to scale CSS. And this is kind of a result of this. Tailwind is a result of what he found when he basically kept trying to do all the maintainable things like BEM syntax, all this kind of stuff, and it just never quite worked. And that's where Tailwind came from. So really, Tailwind is actually a design system. So everything in Tailwind is configurable. All these atomic classes are all generated by Tailwind CLI. So we will set up a config file, and we can adjust anything we want in this config file. And Tailwind is going to process that along with some other bits and bobs, which we'll set up in a second. And then it will output all these styles for us. And this is really beneficial because design systems are good. They keep us in sort of boundaries. And if you've got a design team, you can kind of encode your design system into this. We use Tailwind CSS at Enable. We have a designer and we have some UX specific people, and they've created a config file for Tailwind. And then all the developers can just get on and use it, knowing that they're using kind of safe stuff. So in that design system, by default, you get things like a color palette. This is just a small example. There's actually like 23 colors, I think, in there by default, and they all have this range of shades in them. But you can either tweak this, or you can throw it out completely and replace it with your own. Same with the spacing. Okay, so anything that's space related is configured here. This is sort of a default scale, but again, you can tweak and change this however you want to as well. And it even does sort of some of the more interesting stuff. So things like pseudo elements and things like this, being able to affect styles on odd or even numbered rows on tables, all that kind of stuff. You can do all of that with Tailwind, okay? And this is kind of a quick example of what that config file looks like. It's just a JavaScript config object. So here, this example is actually replacing the default color palette with these particular colors that I've specified. But I could also just extend it as well if I wanted to. Like I say, this is very flexible. It's been built to be very flexible. So another good analogy to kind of wrap this bit up for Tailwind is to think of it like Lego. So you get all these various Lego blocks, and then you can compose them together to create the shape that you want to create. If you don't like something about it, you can just pull out the specific block you don't like and just swap it with another one really quickly and easily. And that's really where the power is. So a bit about Tailwind. Let's start tying this in with Blazor now. So how would we actually get Tailwind and Blazor working together? Well, the first option you've got with getting started with Tailwind is to use the Play CDN. Now, this is the quickest and easiest way to get started with Tailwind. It's designed for people who either want to get a feel for it and try it out really quickly and easily, or if you want to do some rapid prototyping, okay? So in order to do this, all you've got to do is add this script tag in the head of the document, and then you just start writing your utility styles, okay? Now that JavaScript file, what it does is it actually monitors the DOM, and it's going to generate a style tag automatically with the relevant classes in it. This isn't a production option though. It's worth bearing that in mind, okay? Because it is doing all that work on the fly. You don't want that in a real app that's out being used by real customers or anything like that. But it's very, very good for rapid prototyping and just trying things out. The one that we're going to look at more today is option 2, and that's the Tailwind CLI, and this is what you would use if you were building an app for real. Now, the Tailwind CLI comes in 2 flavors. So there's one flavor of this, which is done through NPM. If you're someone who's not a fan of NPM, then there is also a standalone executable as well. You can get that from their GitHub page. You can just go to the releases, and it's there as a standalone file that you can use. But today I'm going to use NPM because I personally just think it's a bit easier to manage. So with that said, let's get our PowerPoint and look at some code. So if I just jump over here. Right, so I've got a Blazor WebAssembly application here that we're going to use for the rest of this. This is slightly modified. I've got rid of the original styling. I've been working with Blazor for a very long time now, and I am quite sick of that template that you get with the purple gradient down the side. So what we're going to do is try and make this look a little prettier today. But the first thing we need to do is actually get Tailwind installed into this project. So what are we going to do? Well, I'm going to jump over to my terminal here, and hopefully that's big enough to see. If I can bump it up a bit more, perhaps. Yeah. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to run a command, and it's called Tailwind CSS init. Specifically, I'm using npx here, not npm. This means I'm not going to get a node modules folder installed into this project. It uses a system cache, so it's a little bit nicer in that perspective. But what this is going to do is generate, for me, a tailwind.config.js file. So if I go back over to Visual Studio now, this is that file that's just been generated for us. Now, there's not a lot I have to do here. If I don't want to change the design system, I'm happy with the defaults, then we're pretty much good to go. The only thing that we do need to do is tell Tailwind what files are going to contain all of these utility classes. And that's because Tailwind is going to be generating our output CSS file on the fly. And it needs to monitor these files so that every time we use a new utility class, it's going to bake that into the new output file for us. Okay, so we do that by going in this content array here. And I'm just going to add in this path. I'm going to say anything that ends in .razor or .html might contain a utility class. So keep an eye on those things for changes. So with that, the other piece I need to do in my project here is I need to add an input style file. So I'm going to create a new folder, and I'm going to call that styles. And then inside of there, I'm going to add in a new CSS file. So I'll call that app.css. And I'm going to get rid of what's in there by default. And then I'm just going to pop in these 3 Tailwind directives. Now, Tailwind is going to process these, and it's going to expand them out into lots and lots of various CSS classes in the output file. This is going to include things like CSS resets and stuff like that. So we'll see that in action in a second. But that's kind of what we're doing inside of the project. So I'm going to go back over to my terminal now, and I'm going to get this up and running. So this time I'm going to say npx Tailwind CSS again. But now I'm going to give it an input file, and I'm going to say, look at that styles file, that app CSS in the styles folder that we just created. That's your input file. And then send the output file into the www root folder, CSS folder. And then also I've got --watch on the end there. And that's telling Tailwind to just go into like a hot reload mode. So it's going to watch all those files that we specified in that content array for any usage, and it's going to regenerate that output file every time we use a new utility class. So let's get that going. Cool, so that's built that. We'll quickly go and have a look at that. So if we go in our www root folder, and here is that outputted CSS. So this is what Tailwind has generated from those 3 lines that we put in, those 3 directives. You can see there's quite a lot in here. And this is what those individual utility classes look like. Like I say, most of the time they're targeting a specific CSS property, okay? So one more thing, and then we can see this working, is we're going to go into the host page here, and I'm just going to add a reference to that style sheet that we've just created. And then I'm going to pop over here, and I'm going to run .NET Watch, and we can see this going. I'm doing this from here and not from Visual Studio because hot reload in Visual Studio is, ironically, a bit of a hot mess. So it's far better when you do it from the CLI. So this is what my version of the reimagined Blazor template looks like. So no purple gradients here. So I've already put some styling on this, as you can see, because watch me type all of this is not particularly interesting. But I've left a few bits unstyled so we can work through this together and kind of get a feel for what it's like to use Tailwind as developers. So for example, here we've got, this is actually meant to be a heading, and this is some paragraph text. So there's not a lot of difference there, so we probably want to do something about that. And over here on the right-hand side, we have something that should be a big focal point, but it kind of looks a bit bland and weird at the moment as well. So we're going to have a look at that as well. So let's go over back over into Visual Studio and get going. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to start off by going on the index component here, and we're going to have a look at this H1 tag. Okay, we want H1s to be big and bold. They're meant to be our primary heading. So what can we do here? Well, what we can do for starters is we can say, right, we want this to be really bold, so we want extra bold font. So if I go over there, and you can see, hopefully, that I've got a bold font. Okay, so that's a bit better, but it's still really small. So I'm going to say I want to have really big text. I want 7XL for my text. So I go back over, and now I've got some bigger text. Okay, so now it's starting to look more like a header. Okay, it's starting to look a little bit better. But there's not a lot of space below it. We could do with a little bit of breathing room for this. So I'm going to put a margin bottom of 6 on there. So if I save that and we go back, and now we've got something that looks a bit more like a header. Okay. Now, I've been rabbiting on, but you can see that's a fairly quick iterative process doing that, especially when you've got hot reload and tools like that working for you. This is a really quick process to iterate through. Also, no, I've still not written any CSS. So that's pretty cool. The paragraph tag as well, we can do something a little bit better with that. So let's put text XL on this one, make it a little bit bigger. And I do want to have a lot of space between that and the object below it. So I'm going to put a margin bottom of 20 on there. Okay, so we've got a bit of a spacing now. Okay. And that's basically what the real basic fundamental experience is like. You just kind of pop these classes in, hit save, and boom, it updates and changes. And you can kind of fiddle around really quickly. This can be a very iterative process. You can iterate on designs very quickly. So what about something a little bit more interesting? Okay, let's have a look at this box on the right now. Now, I've been writing CSS for a lot of years, more than I care to admit. I've also done table layouts in CSS, so that kind of dates me a little bit. And gradients is one of those things in CSS, no matter how many times I write them, I can never quite remember the syntax. I can never think without going and looking at the documentation what I need to do. What if I want to do something like that in Tailwind? Well, basically, these three classes are going to do that for me. So background gradient to bottom right is what that first one is, and that's going to start in the top left. And then I'm going to say I want to start from green 400 and I want to transition to blue 500. So if I save that and we jump back over, I've now got a gradient. Okay, I've not had to worry about that syntax and order and commas and whatever else that you need to do in gradients. It's just three classes and I'm done. If I want to put something a little bit more interesting on that, so I want to maybe swap them around when I hover, I can do another two classes, and this time around, I'm just going to stick hover in front of them, and I'm just reversing the colors. Okay, so this time, if I go back over here, I can just hover over, and now my gradient reverses. Okay, so these slightly more sort of interesting things are, again, pretty trivial to do with Tailwind. The other thing as well is moving things around kind of spatially. So this bit of text down here is actually meant to be the survey prompt, and it probably should be a little bit more kind of in your face. So let's go and see what we can do with this. So if I open up the survey prompt, I'm just going to change its initial styling a little bit, give it a bit more oomph. So I'm going to plonk a load of stuff in there that's going to make it look now like a survey prompt, stand out a little bit more on the page. But everything here is really square. It'd be nice if it was like a little bit more kind of angled and stuff, made it look more like a banner being pasted on the page. So how can I rotate it and kind of transform this element slightly? Well, again, it's relatively trivial. This is two classes in Tailwind. So I can just say transform and then rotate. And in this case, I want it to go counterclockwise, so I've got a little minus number in front of that. And if I go over there, and it just skews my element. Okay, so doing that kind of spatial stuff, moving elements around and stuff like that, again, is fairly easy to do. Cool, so that's some kind of basic bits about how you can style using Tailwind. And hopefully you can see it can be a quick and iterative process, and people new to Tailwind always see this, and it's certainly something I went through. This is great, but aren't we missing some of the key benefits of CSS here? Like, you've styled that particular H1 and you styled that particular paragraph tag. But what happens when you go on, the other pages? So if we go over to the counter page, no, there's no styling there. There's no styling on the fetch data either. Okay, we've lost the biggest benefit of CSS. We're not cascading anything here. Okay, so what do you do in that scenario? The other thing as well is on the right-hand side, we've got this gradient box. We've also got that on the other pages, and that's not being styled either. And that's a slightly different problem because that's a sort of some repeated markup and stuff. So there's a couple of options we've got here to sort these problems out. So the first one is that input style file that we created at the start. So this can be quite powerful for leveraging that sort of classic CSS power, which is, cascading. So with that, I can come in here and I can actually create normal CSS classes, but because this is going to get processed by Tailwind, I can still use Tailwind's utility classes here with the apply directive. So I can say from an H1, can you please apply these utility classes to it? So I'm still not writing any CSS here. I'm still using the utility classes. I'm defining a class, so it's kind of a slight gray area, but you can see what I mean. So if I save that and then I go back over to my index component over here, I'm just going to get rid of those definitions I put on the H1 and the P tag. And if you go back to the app, you can see now that no matter what page I go on, I've got all those styles because I'm getting the traditional power of CSS coming through. So if you're just going to style elements, common elements, so H1s, Ps, anchor tags, things like that, you can use this technique and you can get that site-wide effect, but you can still get the power of that Tailwind design system. So what about this bit on the right-hand side where we've got this repeated markup? Well, this one is going to be solved by Blazor. So this is a perfect example of where a component can be used. So in my share folder here, I'm just going to create a new component. I'll call it Tailwind. And then inside of there, I'm going to just pop in the same code that's repeated on every single page. So I can save that off. And then if I go over here, I can just replace what I've already got in each page. There we go. So I can add in that component there. I can do the same on the fetch data page. So if I come down here, I can replace this. And I'll do the same thing on the counter page as well, just to be completely neat and tidy. We save all them off, go back, and now I can go between my pages and I've got all the same stuff. Okay, so those are kind of the two scenarios you're going to run into when you're using Tailwind and Blazor that you're going to want to deal with, and that's kind of two techniques you can use so you don't end up repeating yourself over and over again. Right, so we've done some fairly trivial stuff so far perhaps, so let's do something a little bit more meaty. Let's talk about animations. Let's create an animation using Tailwind and Blazor and no JavaScript whatsoever. So what we're going to do is on the home page, let's have that big Tailwind logo on the right hand side. Let's have it slide in when we first load the page just to make it look a little bit more interesting. So how would we go about doing that? Well, we're going to use a feature in Blazor called templated components to start off with. So I'm going to create a new component and I'm just going to call it imaginatively slide in. And I'm going to pop in some initial markup for this. So templated components in Blazor, if you're not aware, they allow you to wrap some content and then you can manipulate it and do things with it. So in this case, what we're going to do is we're going to wrap some content and then we're going to capture that in this child content parameter down here. And we're going to output it in this div, and then we're going to manipulate this div in order to create the animation. So the first thing we do is set some initial styles on this div. So let me pop them in first. So what we're going to do here is we're going to say this div should take up the full height of the parent. That's what hfull does. And then we're going to say for any of the CSS properties that we manipulate on this particular component, we want to transition their values over a duration of 500 milliseconds. Okay? That's what's going to give us our animation effect, and you'll see how this comes together in a minute. We've got transform on there as well because we're going to want to move this element around in a second. We're going to want to push it off the page so we can let it animate back in. And then the other thing that we're doing here is we're just going to output whatever the value is of this animation styles field, okay, that we've got defined down here. And we haven't got anything in it at the moment, so let's pop some stuff in there. So the two classes that we're putting in here are translate x full and opacity 0. So translate x full is going to push this particular element, its full width to the right on the x-axis, basically. So for us, it's going to push it off the right-hand side of the screen. And then I'm going to set the opacity to 0, which means it's going to take up the same physical space, it's just going to be transparent, okay, and we're not going to see it. So that's going to be where our starting point is of anything that we wrap with this component. So the next thing we're going to do is pop in a method, and this method is we're going to trigger this method in a second, and this is going to be what swaps over the classes, and this is what's going to create the transition effect, okay? Now you'll notice the key thing to understand here is that I'm updating the same two CSS properties fundamentally with these Tailwind classes I'm using. So I'm adjusting translate x, but I'm now moving it to 0, which essentially puts it back to wherever its original render point was. Okay, so we pushed it off originally, and this is going to say set it back to wherever it should be. And then I'm setting the opacity back to 100, so I'm making it visible again. So the key thing here is all of this in combination with transition and duration 500 is going to mean that all that is going to happen over half a second, and that is what's going to create that animation effect for us. And then because we're going to call this through a lifecycle method in Blazor called onAfterRender, we also need to tell Blazor to do another re-render, so that's what that state has changed call is there for. So the bit that hooks all this up is the onAfterRender method. This is one of three sort of lifecycle methods in Blazor components if you've not used Blazor before. And as the method name suggests, it runs after the component renders. So we want everything to render on the screen, then we want this animation to happen. And all we're saying is if it's the first render, wait for 300 milliseconds, just make sure everything is painted, and then we're going to trigger that animation method. All right. So that's our component. If we go back over to our home page, and then I'm just going to wrap that existing Tailwind component in our slide-in component, okay? So let's pop that in there, and then that. Cool, hit that. And then, hopefully, if I let hot reload do that rebuild, we have an animation, okay? So it's good, it's not perfect though. If you eagle-eyed watch at the bottom of the screen if you can, and you will see there is actually a scroll bar at the bottom, which is kind of annoying. And that's the browser being very helpful to us. It's going, oh, this thing's off the screen. You probably want to get there. Let me just give you a scroll bar so you can do that. But that isn't actually what we want in this case. So we can fix this pretty quickly as well. So we'll just go back over to the host page for this app. And then on the body, I'm just going to pop in a quick fix here. So I'm going to say, if we overflow on the x-axis, just hide it. Okay, so don't show anything. So if we save that, and then I just do need to do a refresh, a hard refresh, because that never thing, and now we've got rid of that scroll bar. Okay, so we've got a nice smooth animation here using Tailwind, Blazor, no JavaScript. So that's quite a nice effect, and it shows you can do these slightly more advanced things when you put these two frameworks together. So the final thing I want to show you, and to wrap things up, is this is great, but how do I take this actually to production? I want to go and deploy it to my website, okay? We've got this lovely, beautiful Blazor application now. The rest of the world should see it. How do we do that? Well, obviously we can't sit here running our Tailwind CLI, and we don't really want to go and commit this app CSS file over here into our production, into our source control, because this is a generated file, all right? So that wouldn't be a very good thing to do. So how do we do this? Well, you could go and add a script in your CI pipeline that's going to run all this for you, but there is actually another way you can do it as well. So we can actually go in the CS proj, and we can actually add some targets in here. So we can add two targets. So the first one, in this case, because I'm using npm to do this, is going to be a check for npm. So this is just going to trigger during the normal build process for this particular project. So it's going to look, and it's going to run the npm-v command, which just checks npm's version. And if it doesn't get a response, it's just going to throw out an error and say, you must have npm installed. So that's kind of a bit of sanity checking. And then next, it's going to run the build CSS target. And that is just going to run that same npx command that we had before. And it's got the same input file and output file. But this time, we're going to use --minify on the end. And that's just going to create a minified CSS file for us that we can take to production. So if I just cancel the Tailwind CLI that's running there, and I'm also going to cancel hot reload that's going on over there. And I'm going to change this over to release mode, because again, I've put a little sanity check in here that says only do this if we're building for release mode. I can then build the same project again. And once that's finished building, and we'll see down here in a second, you can see it's outputted the npm version there. Okay, so we can see that working. If we go back over to app CSS, you can now see that we've got a minified CSS file. Okay, everything's been compressed down onto one line. Okay, and we're now ready to take this and deploy this wherever we want to. Cool, so bit of a whistle-stop tour, but hopefully this has been interesting for you. If you've got any questions, feel free to come and ask me, and I'll be bumbling around outside, but otherwise enjoy the rest of the conference, and thank you for coming.